It's a Friday. Finally. It's been a long week. But we got to Friday, last show of the week. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Jmull Show, part of the 110 Sports Network, whether you're watching on twitch.tv/Jmull Show or on our website at 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday. You know, every once in a while there are things that happen that are just inexplicable. And one of those things happened this morning around my household. So I woke up, a couple hours ago, started preparing for the show, made some coffee, got some breakfast, and then it became clear that my lovely mother could not find her keys. And we spent, has this ever happened, you guys? Like, we all remember her having her keys last night in this house. She didn't leave after we saw her with them in this house. She unlocked the car last night to put something in there, and they've just disappeared. We spent a good hour looking for them. Shouts to my dad for actually buying another key fob for her car so that she could just grab that one and still go where she needed to be. But it's just absolutely inexplicable. Like, it's driving me crazy. Like, we're gonna do the show here on a Friday, and I'll lay the agenda here in a second. But we're gonna do this, and then we're gonna go off the air, and I'm gonna go back to looking for the keys because I can't get it out of my mind. But before I get to that and restart my journey to find the car keys, we got a show to do, lots to get to today. Some topics that aren't exactly fun to talk about but are important to talk about, which is what we're going to start with. But at around 11:25 or so, we'll talk impact players in the bottom five in the Eastern Conference. If you haven't been around, earlier this week we did the bottom five teams looking outside of the playoffs, looking in for the Western Conference, and then did the bottom four teams, seeds 5 through 8 in the Western Conference. Now we're doing the bottom four teams in the Eastern Conference playoffs right now, and of course throwing the Wizards in there as well, because apparently it was important for the Wizards to go without their three best players. But we'll talk about that at 11:20, 11:40 or so. The Podium, most debated sports topics, is the Podium today. Bronze, silver, gold. So we'll do that at roughly 11:40, and then we'll do FYI and get out of here. But I want to start with something that's just truly devastating and horrifying, and any other word you'd like to use to describe what the Washington, D.C. area football team, NFL franchise, has become over the last week, and specifically the story that the Washington Post published yesterday about 15 different women over essentially a 15-year period, talking about the sexual misconduct, the inappropriate workplace behavior, they were calling it what it was. They were calling it the hell that they went through as women in a professional sports world that already objectifies women to an extent that it shouldn't, but specifically in a Washington organization that a culture of using women as objects rather than colleagues was certainly the norm, and another thing that Dan Snyder just sort of let go by that he shouldn't. Before we sort of talk about it and break it down a little bit, there are a couple things I want to point out. First, we have to take a moment to appreciate what these women were willing to do to come and talk to the Washington Post. Of course, Emily Applegate, the woman who was sort of the face of this story because she allowed her name to be used, and she spoke not on the record, but she spoke without anonymity. So her name is a part of the story. There might be one other woman who actually worked for the Redskins who had used her name, but for the most part, these women were speaking on terms of anonymity, and Emily Applegate was one who didn't, as well as the professional sports reporters, the women who also spoke to the Washington Post for this story. It's not easy to do, and I won't act like I am even remotely close to understanding what that feeling must be like and what goes on in a woman's head when she's trying to decide if she wants to speak up about this. So I won't even pretend to know how difficult of a decision that is. But these kind of things will come with scrutiny, and there will be people who say this is a publicity grab, so on and so forth. Inexplicably, I don't know how anybody would speak like that and assume that this would be anything but a push to change a culture that is allowed to live on in the Washington organization and, quite frankly, in the sports world in general. The other thing I want to put out there is this conversation is not about whether or not this is bad enough for Dan Snyder to keep his job or to continue to be able to go on owning the Washington Redskins or Washington's NFL franchise. That's not what's important here. And I saw that on Twitter, just saying, I'm sorry, Washington fans, but if this probably isn't a big enough deal, this probably isn't bad enough considering Snyder wasn't actually the one who the allegations were against. This probably isn't bad enough for him to lose his place as the owner of Washington's NFL franchise. Which is just ridiculous, and I think it's a little bit similar to how the balance between any professional athlete nowadays getting COVID-19, wanting that person to just be okay with the virus that we don't really understand completely yet and don't have a way to stop yet, and trying to discuss what that means for the future of the NBA team, what that means in a 7-game series, so on and so forth. I think it's a little similar to that because it's ultimately not important whether or not he keeps his job or not. What's important here is making sure that this creates a push to change an issue that frankly spreads across the entire professional sports landscape, at least in this country. And I'm sure there are issues with it across the world. I'm just more familiar, of course, being in this country, more familiar with the issues that go on this continent and in North America. But what's important here is that, along with, respecting women in sports as professionals and as sports minds, instead of, normalizing that, the way that everybody looks at a man in the sports industry. Let's make this a push to normalize commenting on a woman's ability to write, on a woman's ability to lead, not as, quote unquote, for a woman, which is just as bad. It's like we talked about with Pat Chambers in the Penn State men's basketball program when he made a comment to Rasir Bolton how well spoken his parents were, which is, there's an implication as for a black man and woman, which is, just as bad as some of these other things. So let's normalize the respect of women in sports as professionals, like men in sports are respected as professionals, instead of using them as essentially how the Redskins were using them as props in their marketing and ticket selling game. Commenting on their bodies, their clothes, or what they're doing and how they're doing it as quote unquote good for a woman. There are two things that just absolutely break my heart here and are devastating and horrifying, and why I have absolutely no issue using the word disgrace and just using and just despising Washington's franchise with every fiber of my being, to be honest with you. The first thing is that it's clear that the professional sports world as a career can so abruptly go from a dream job to a nightmare because of the objectification that women see in this field every day. I mean, Emily Applegate said this, that it went from a job that she wanted her entire life, knowing that she wanted to work in sports. It went from a job that she had worked so hard for to a job that she couldn't wait to get out of because of what she was experiencing on a daily basis. Working in sports is the coolest job in the world. It just is. I mean, essentially, it's working with an organization, reporting on however you're involved in sports as a career. It's a game at the end of the day. And that's just, it's reporting and getting to work on a game and getting paid to do it. I mean, that's just the coolest job in the world. In terms of the importance, it's pretty low on the important. I mean, there are so many people who are doing more important things than reporting on sports. And I don't think we need to list those things that come to everybody's head. But it's the coolest job in the world. And, you know, there's that sort of caveat that you can't just work in sports because you love sports. But that's at the foundation of everybody who works in sports. Everybody. That they love sports. And getting to cover and work with something that you love is just the coolest thing ever. So that's heartbreaking that it can be ripped away because of things that have nothing to do with your ability to do your job. And that quite frankly sucks to an incredible degree. It sucks. You know, people like Emily Applegate who work for these organizations and are subjected to it on a daily basis, and then incredible sports reporters like Rhiannon Walker at The Athletic and Nora Princiati who's now at The Ringer, but were both referenced and were quoted in this article. It's just absolutely heartbreaking that in order to be a woman in sports, in order to be a woman in the sports world, it's not an if, but a when you're subjected to the objectification of your body, the objectification of what you're wearing and how you look rather than who you are as a professional, something that men never have to worry about. It's just so heartbreaking that, you know, in the story they talk about, you know, there's this their formal onboarding and orientation that they get from the Washington franchise, but then there's this informal, but they used informal but invaluable orientation from the older female employees at the organization, basically telling new women on the job where not to go, the people to avoid, and the places that they shouldn't catch themselves in their own building that they work in. I mean, the Redskins apparently in their building have a glass staircase that men will stand under the staircase and just look up. You know how disgusting that is? And how heartbreaking this is not that it's not an if this happens or a when this happens. It's not an if this happens, it's a when this happens. And that the female, and that not only do the female employees that exist there already have to do this kind of thing, but all of the women talked about how little of the orientation talks about where you will go in case there is an issue of inappropriate behavior in the workplace. One full-time human resources person. There was no HR department for Washington for a long time. And it wasn't discussed really where you were supposed to go if this kind of thing happened, which is just incredibly telling about the culture that Dan Snyder, the owner of the Redskins, has allowed to happen. And it's just another, and like I said, this isn't about Snyder keeping his job or not, but it's another reason why he clearly isn't why he clearly shouldn't be able to continue to do this, in my opinion. And it wasn't even subtle. I mean, you have Larry Michael, the voice of the Redskins for a long time, Alex Santos, Richard Mann, Dennis Green, Mitch Gershman, all who were cited in this article as being part of the problem. And it's not even like they're trying to hide it, which means they're not scared of it. And that it's so, like, the things that we do out in public are normalized for the most part. You know what I mean? Like, the things we do in public, we're typically not worried about wanting privacy for, or it's, for the most part, things we're not worried about getting in trouble for. And clearly these people were not worried about getting in trouble. I mean, Larry Michael on set of a video film talking about a college-age intern. This is an old man. This is not this dude is not young. He's been the voice of the Redskins for a long time. And talking about a college-level intern in front of people, like on a hot mic. Hot mic, for those who don't know, a mic that is on and is being transmitted somewhere. Right now, my mic is hot. During the commercial break, I mute the mic and it's no longer, and the mic is off. Santos at a bar in Indianapolis during the NFL Combine, going on and on about how he wants to date, I believe it was Rhiannon Walker. Just going on and on about it. A married man. And then essentially walking up to her and telling her that. And then touching her in front of everybody. And instead of Santos being the one who is worried about what it might do to his career, which, that's neither here nor there. It's Walker who talks about in the article about being worried if people were going to see it and take it the wrong way. Like she had asked for the attention, had asked for the physical contact. You know how messed up that is? That she's the one who has to worry about Santos's actions because of the way it might reflect on her. Because the way that this culture works is that there's a benefit of the doubt for men and just a jumping into a conclusion for women. And that is horrifying, and it needs to change. And hopefully this is part of the push for a change in this industry where women no longer have to be, we don't have to tell women that they're going to face sexual harassment in the work, because that's what clearly was happening in Washington. That when women joined this organization, they were being told by the other women already there that this is going to happen. That's where this needs to change, so that women don't have to enter the sports world with the understanding that this is going to happen. Because that's just wrong. And that's why the Washington NFL franchise is a disgrace. Coming up next on the Jmull Show, we'll chat about the impact players of the bottom 5 teams in the Eastern Conference: Washington, Brooklyn, Orlando, Philly, and Indiana. We'll do that next on the Jmull Show on 110sportsmedia.com. We're back on the Jmull Show. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday, making us a part of your day. Hope it's not too bad of a Friday. Hope it's going by quickly. We're almost to lunchtime, especially on the East Coast, 11:25. Working towards the weekend. Almost there. Very, very, very excited for the weekend. But thank you so much for making us a part of your day. 110sportsmedia.com/live, twitch.tv/the Jmull Show. Check out 110sportsmedia.com if you haven't in the last couple days. If you subscribe to the 110 Sports newsletter, you should have gotten an email in your inbox today. If you haven't yet, you should be pretty soon. Never miss a content if you get that newsletter. But what I want to talk about now is impact players in the Eastern Conference, bottom of the Eastern Conference in particular, if you haven't been around for the last couple days. We did the bottom 5 teams outside looking in on the Western Conference side of things, and then did the bottom 4 teams in the Western Conference playoff picture at this moment. But since there are only 9 teams in the Eastern Conference that are participating in the bubble, we're doing the bottom 5 teams, the bottom 4 teams in the playoff picture, and throw in Washington as well. But let's jump right in, shall we? Number 1, Washington. Anybody. Can anybody be an impact player? This is a Washington team that is not good. This is a Washington team that is, wait for it, 24-40. First of all, it's ridiculous that this team gets a chance to be in the playoffs. Ridiculous. Now, whatever. I mean, they're not going to make the playoffs because they have nobody. Bertans, Wall, Beal, none of them are there. So it's not like they're going to actually make the playoffs. But it's a little ridiculous that a 24-40 team still is given a chance to make the playoffs. That's a little ridiculous. But that's ultimately neither here nor there because they have absolutely nobody, and that's going to be the storyline for Washington moving into the bubble. I mean, Troy Brown Jr. maybe, Rui Hachimura, these guys who have both been decent this year, can they sort of step up, make some sort of impact? Because somebody's going to have to if they're going to score any kind of a respectable number of points. I mean, they've got a lot of guys averaging in like the 12, 13-ish points per game range, but Beal was the one carrying this offense, averaging 30.5 this season. You know, Beal is quickly becoming one of the 10 best players in the NBA. 30.5. That's a lot of points. And if they're going to score at all, relatively speaking, somebody's going to have to step up, and it's probably going to be a young guy because that's basically what this team is right now, especially without Bertans and Wall, along with Beal sitting out of the bubble. In Orlando, I went with Evan Fournier. First of all, Fournier is the least talked about really good basketball player in the NBA. He just sort of, and part of it's because he plays for the Orlando Magic in the back half of the 2010s, and that's just not a recipe for getting talked about a lot. I mean, the Magic in general just sort of forgotten about it. It feels like they've been hovering around the 8 seed for the last 6 years. They're never absolutely awful, but they're never all that good. And, you know, this is yet another example of them not being all that good. But Fournier has a player option at the end of this year. So, I mean, he's an 18.8 points per game guy who shoots it from 41% from the three-point line. Every NBA, there are 30 NBA teams who would like that on their roster. 18 points, 40% for shooting from deep. And specifically any team who fancies themselves pretty soon as an NBA title contender. And this is just sort of, and as an extension, this is just, I mean, at some point, either this Orlando roster is going to be one that you feel like you can win with, or you're just going to have to break it up because they've got a lot of fine players on their team. And from an eye test perspective, I find their roster really interesting in a lot of ways. You got your Markelle Fultz, Terrence Ross, Evan Fournier, Mo Bamba, Aaron Gordon, Vucevic, DJ Augustine, who's still good, Michael Carter-Williams, Jonathan Isaac, who may or may not play. There's no reason to rush the 22-year-old back in for a bubble in which they're really just fighting to either lose to Toronto or Milwaukee in the first round of the playoffs. Al-Farouq Aminu, James Ennis is at the bottom of this roster. There are just some interesting guys on this roster that, and from an eye test perspective, I mean, a Fultz, Fournier, Gordon, Vucevic, Bamba starting five. That ain't all bad. But clearly it's not inspiring, and it hasn't been inspiring for a long time. And you need somebody to, I mean, Vucevic has been an all-star, yes, but there's only so much that a one-time all-star center can do from a upping the ceiling of your team. So I Evan Fournier, he'll make an impact if the Magic want to make any sort of noise in the bubble. But it's also just interesting to see what he might do at the end of the season, having a player option. I think he's supposed to make $17 million next year. Let's see. We'll see if he decides to take advantage of that or enter free agency. But Fournier for the Magic, really Washington and Orlando, along with this next team who's even worse, but has an interesting player for a different reason. It's just sort of like the Eastern Conference is at the bottom of the playoffs every year, just seeing who gets to lose to the 1 seed, and it's really never all that competitive. In Brooklyn, I think it's got to be Caris LeVert, who apparently he's good to go now. He's struggled with injuries the last couple of years, but the question with Caris LeVert is he a guy that is good enough to put next to Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant as a viable third guy, third star or almost star with those guys, and you go win a championship? That's the biggest question with LeVert, because I think either way, you're either going to get a LeVert who you decide, we think he's good enough, let's keep him around, see what we can do with him, or you're going to get a LeVert who's still really good, because that's, whether or not the Brooklyn franchise decides if Caris LeVert is the guy to go along with them, he's still a guy averaging 17.7 points and shoots at 39% from the 3-point line, pulls down 4 rebounds and 4 assists. Like, that's a guy who can be who's attractive, and he's really attractive in a trade package to go get a bigger star like a Bradley Beal. So like Orlando and like Washington, I mean, talking about impact players is almost silly, because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because these teams aren't going to do anything in the playoffs. But can LeVert be that guy? Does he make an impression, and we decide that, we being the Brooklyn franchise decides that's the guy that we want next to Kyrie and KD as we try to turn our team into a relevant basketball team once again? Because he fits. He certainly does from just an eye test perspective. You throw him at the 2 guard with KD at the 3/4, and Kyrie is the point guard. And then you've got these other guys. You got a DeAndre Jordan, who's also not playing, and that's part of the Nets issue here, is that just everybody and their mother isn't playing. But then you've got DeAndre Jordan, Spencer Dinwiddie, Joe Harris, Torian Waller-Prince, Wilson Chandler, Like there are some guys here that you look at and you can create a team that I think is pretty good. To be honest with you, now I have my feelings about Kyrie Irving. But Irving, Dinwiddie, KD, that kind of thing. Is it LeVert who's the guy going forward in that two guard spot, or is it a guy that they go and get using LeVert as leverage? We'll see. Next, Philly, and now we can really start to talk about impact players and how they might impact the actual scope of the playoffs. For the Sixers, I went with Tobias Harris because Tobias Harris is the only guy on the Sixers roster who plays big minutes, who has the ability to shoot it well enough to stretch the floor every time down the floor on the offensive end. Embiid excels in the post. He's a much better 3-point shooter now, and he's one of the best centers in the NBA, if not the best center in the NBA, depending on where you put other guys and where you categorize them in terms of position. But Ben Simmons needs space because he's not knocking down any shots, and where he's best is downhill, making passes over the defense to players on the perimeter. That's where he's at his best. And of course in the open court. I mean, there's very few players who are more dynamic in transition than Ben Simmons is. And then Embiid is the same way. I mean, he's a gifted offensive talent. But of course it makes more sense that when he's got more room to operate, he can be even more impressive. Al Horford can space the floor a little bit, but nobody's terrified of Al Horford from the perimeter. And nobody's terrified of Tobias Harris right now either. But if you can get it to a point where people are terrified of Tobias Harris, and that just keeps one guy out of the paint at all times because you can stick Tobias Harris in the corner if he doesn't have the ball, and you just need to stick on him because he's going to knock down that shot if you don't, then I think that's really helpful. Because they're a massive team with a lot of guys who are at their best in places that aren't the 3-point line. And they need somebody to be consistent. It's one of the reasons that I was really not a fan of JJ Redick leaving Philly. Not for JJ Redick's sake, but for Philly's sake. If I was Philly, I would have tried my best to keep him around because of what he did for a crunch time offense. And I know JJ's a little bit of a defensive liability. Not massive, but certainly not a great defender by any stretch of the imagination. But that's what Philly's missing. And you can look at any title team anytime recently, and they've got great 3-point shooters. Formidable 3-point shooters, guys that will knock down 3-point shots in big moments. Does Philly have that? I'm not sure. But Tobias Harris might be the closest thing to that in terms of being that guy in the playoffs that will knock down a 3-pointer if you need him to. And finally, Indiana, I think, and it's still up in the air if Oladipo is actually going to play. I mean, of course, on July 3rd, he said he wasn't going to play. And then we talked about this earlier this week. But, on July 3rd, he said he wasn't going to play. And now July 11th, he's participating in 5-on-5 for the first time in months. Playing lots in the bubble, apparently, with, inter-squad scrimmages. So that's still up in the air. And, of course, the point of this exercise is to not pick the best player on the team, which is why it didn't go with Oladipo here, because, of course, he's going to have the most impact. But I went with Brogdon here because Brogdon has to be the focal point of this Indiana offense if Indiana fancies holding on to that 5 seed and not letting Philly get around them. He's got to be that guy. And I think he's a little healthier now, and it's been a while since he has been healthy. And I think he's certainly capable of it. 16 points, 7 assists, 4.7 rebounds. He's certainly capable of it. But when your other best player on offense nowadays is Domas Sabonis, it can't be Sabonis who is having the ultimate biggest impact, just because it's so hard in the way the NBA is played nowadays for the best player on your offensive side of the ball to be a guy who's an interior presence. So, especially without Oladipo, Brogdon is going to have to be huge for the Pacers if they want to hold on to that 5 seed. I think this is, in terms of wanting to get to the second round, I'd much rather play. I mean, your 3 seed's going to be it's probably going to be Boston. I don't see Toronto coughing up a 3-game lead for the 2 seed in 8 games. I'd much rather play Miami than Boston. Much rather. Because that's another team that is led by a guy who isn't exactly proven as being the guy who leads a team in the playoffs, and Jimmy Butler. So that 5 and 6 seed battle, I think, is huge. At the same time, if you're the 6th seed, you don't have to go and play Milwaukee until the Eastern Conference Finals, which might actually be a good thing for teams, of course. But in terms of winning a one playoff series, getting to play Miami instead of getting to play Boston or Toronto is not something that needs to be overlooked. So I think Brogdon is that guy in Indiana if they fancy being a team that can hold on to that 5 seed and really make some sort of noise and impact on the bubble and in the playoffs. When we come back, so that's the impact players for the bottom of the Eastern Conference. We'll jump back over to the Western Conference on Monday and then do the top 4 teams in the Eastern Conference on Wednesday. That's the plan right now. Coming up next on the Jmull Show, we'll do the Podium, the most debated sports topics. Bronze, silver, gold in that category. We'll do that next. You're watching the Jmull Show on 110sportsmedia.com. We're back on the Jmull Show on a Friday. It's been a good week. It's been a long week. Thanks so much for making us a part of your day today. 110sportsmedia.com. Check out all the new content that's gone up over there this week. You can also sign up for our newsletter so that you never miss any of the content. That'll come every Friday, and I believe it should be in your inbox at this point today. If not, it's coming shortly. Thank you once again for making us a part of your day. Let's hop into the podium. Do this every Friday. Just a random topic. And to be completely transparent, somebody was talking about this on a radio show here in Memphis earlier this week. I thought that's a good one, so I'm going to use that. I'm going to bum that just a little bit, and that's what we'll do for the podium today. But bronze medal coming in third in the most debated sports topics. Should players who use steroids be allowed in the Baseball Hall of Fame? And, of course, this is... If we don't debate it a little bit, this isn't nearly as fun. So, the short answer, in my opinion, is yes. They should, for a couple reasons. The first and the biggest one being that it's just sort of understood that a lot of baseball players were juicing. So, if everyone was juicing, the best players are still the best players. If everybody's juicing, in theory, everyone has an unfair advantage. So if everyone has an unfair advantage, and there are still guys who are better than everybody, then those guys would be better than everybody even if nobody else was juicing, right? I mean, stands to reason. If everybody's got $50 except a guy who has 75, and you give everybody 50 more bucks, the guy with 75 still has 25 more bucks than the guys who started with 50. It's a very simple and elementary metaphor. But the point is still the same. The best players without the juice are going to be the best players with the juice if everybody's juicing. And the other thing, and this is sort of secondary, certainly a secondary reason to that first one, but essentially, and I know there's just some all-time meaning to it, but essentially the Hall of Fame is a museum. At the end of the day, a Hall of Fame is a way to document the history of a sport. Basketball Hall of Fame, NBA Hall of Fame, Baseball Hall of Fame, Football Hall of Fame. It's essentially just a way to document and make sure that somebody's impact on a game lives on longer than their playing days. But it's not just players. It's coaches, figures in those worlds. So it's not just a collection of the best players. It's a collection of the people who helped to define baseball in different eras. And whether you like it or not, that is a part of baseball's history. So in my opinion, those players should be a part of the Hall of Fame, in part for that reason as well. Because at the end of the day, the Hall of Fame is a museum trying to document the best to do it. And whether or not it's because they were juicing or not, guys like Pete Rose, McGuire, Sammy Sosa are some of the best to ever do it. And they should be part of the Hall of Fame. Silver medal. I just went sort of broad here and went with college sports debates. There are a couple of them, nowadays specifically in college basketball. Should the one and done rule be a thing? Should it be taken away? Should the NBA be able to tell their... And I know most of these rules aren't NCAA rules. I mean, the one and done rule is an NBA rule. Having to be 1 year removed from graduating from high school, essentially, or being of high school age, is essentially what's happening there. So, I get that that's not completely under the control of college basketball, and to an extension the governing body of amateur sports at the college level. But that, and then of course in this one that is picked up a lot of steam in the last couple of years, and one that is, I think we're moving towards a spot where where it should be, and that's should college athletes be paid. Really, I think there are certainly logistics that are impossible for when it comes to whether or not a school should be responsible for paying their own athletes, because of course, beyond that stipend and the tuition and room and board scholarship. But because most athletic programs are not lucrative like those of Florida and Ohio State and Michigan and Michigan State, and add whoever you want to in there. Alabama, Texas. So college athletics for a lot of schools are not a lucrative business. And college athletics for most college sports, not a lucrative business. We've seen that recently with what the impact of there might not being a college football season does for other programs at some massive schools like Stanford, who has, I think it was 11 different sports, 11 different teams that ceased to exist. And I think we're going to get to the point. I mean, they're going to vote at the beginning of 2021, and there will be a change fundamentally to that rule. And I don't see any reason why you can't let athletes benefit from their market value and let somebody define what their market value is and pay them what they'd like to pay them, whether that's Nike with Zion Williamson or, a Bloomington car dealership who wants to have Lily King in a car dealership commercial, or parents of swimmers in Bloomington who want to pay Lily King to be a swim coach. Don't see the issue with that. And they're, for $1 billion industry, the athletes who are the reason that all the money is being made should be able to benefit in some way. And then finally, and this is incredibly cookie cutter, and you're probably going to know what this is, and it's not going to be a surprise. I went with LeBron and MJ as the gold medal, LeBron versus MJ, because in my opinion, the debates that get the most heated are the best kind of debates, in a friendly manner. But yes, I'm a sports nerd, and yes, there were certainly nights that I spent in college just debating in a very heated manner about LeBron versus Michael Jordan. And first of all, I'm really sorry to the people, rest in peace, Kobe Bryant, but the people who come in from over here and talk about how Kobe should be in that conversation as well. But LeBron versus MJ is far and away the most heated debate I've ever had when it comes to sports. Like screaming stats, screaming what I've seen, what he did. Some of the memories that stick out the most from my college days are those incredibly passionate debates about whether LeBron is the GOAT or Michael Jordan is the GOAT. And to be honest with you, for a long time I was on the fence, almost leaning towards LeBron, and then The Last Dance comes around and it's pretty clear that it's MJ, unless LeBron does something pretty spectacular in the next 3 years, like win 3 championships and get up to the same level as MJ in terms of how many titles he has. So that's the podium. Every Friday we'll do that. Bronze, should players who use steroids be allowed in the Baseball Hall of Fame? I think the answer is yes. College sports debates, such as the one and done rule and should college athletes be paid, and then LeBron versus MJ. And I think if anybody who watched The Last Dance still doesn't think it's MJ, then I'm not sure exactly what you were watching. But we'll wrap up the show coming up next with some FY and then get out of here for the weekend. But you're watching the Jmull Show on 110sportsmedia.com. Welcome back to the Jmull Show on a Friday. Wrapping up the show here real quick with some FYI. 110sportsmedia.com. Check out all the content there. Subscribe to the newsletter. If you never want to miss any content coming from the website, you'll get that every Friday. But let's hop into some FYI here. Got a couple of good ones. For those of you who don't know, I am now a huge is not the right word, but I am an invested Columbus Crew fan. Columbus Crew is one of just a couple teams to officially punch their ticket to the knockout stage of the MLS's back tournament. Let's go. Huge. Let's go. I believe we're at like a 6-0 goal differential now. I think they won 2-0 last night. Yes, they did. The Red Bulls, just the New York Red Bulls, were no competition. And FC Cincinnati, if Red Bulls weren't any competition, FC Cincinnati shouldn't have even shown up. But the Columbus Crew, along with, I believe, unless this has changed, but along with Orlando City and the Philadelphia Union as the only teams to clinch, to guarantee a berth into the second phase after 2 matches played in the MLS is back tournament. FYI number 2, Tigers going to miss the cut at the Memorial. It's tough. It really is. But that's what's happening here. After, a pretty solid 1-under yesterday at Muirfield Village that was playing incredibly tough. And let me just real quick lay some stats for you. So last week, the Workday Charity Open was also at Muirfield Village. This week, the Memorial, Muirfield Village. After round 1 of the Workday Charity last week, 61 players were under par after round 1. Yesterday, on the same course at the Memorial, just 24 players under par in round 1. I think it's really quite impressive just how much more difficult they can get a golf course to play that quickly and the kind of stuff that goes into that. And Tiger, really, he had a solid day. He really did yesterday. Go back here. He had, 4 birdies, 3 bogeys. That happens on a tough day. Anytime you're under par, let's do it. But today, he was 1 under through 3, but then 3 straight bogeys, 3 bogeys and 6 holes to end his front 9. And then, starting on number 10, holes 1 and 2, a 6 and a 5. And now he's +5 on the day. No. Yes, +5 on the day. And he's got 5 holes left. And the projected cut line is going to be probably around +2. So he's got 2 par 5s. So, there's a chance that he can get it back and maybe sneak into +2 and maybe get lucky and make it to the weekend. But right now it's not looking super likely. So T-Dub getting his first start in since the pandemic and his first start on tour since middle of February. And it hasn't gone swimmingly. And it's when, this is something I've talked about. It's just much harder to play well week in and week out if you're not playing week in and week out, and you're always kind of shaking off the rust after not playing for months and months and months. But that's going to do it for us today. Thank you so much for joining us for another week of the Jmull Show here on the 110 Sports Network. As usual, you can follow 110 Sports on Twitter. Follow me at the Jmull, which you see at the bottom of the screen there. Check out 110sportsmedia.com for the content over there. We'll be back with the Jmull Show 11 a.m. Eastern on Monday. Touchline Talk with Josh Doring and Around the Bases with Chris Brown 11 a.m. Eastern and 1 p.m. Eastern Tuesdays and Thursdays. So they'll be back next week as well for another week of 110 Sports Network. But thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.